This beginning section of the show, after a little bit of kerfuffles, is going to be about the deficit myth, modern monetary theory and the birth of the people's economy, which is a book by Stephanie Kelton and a presentation that I got a 17 out of 20 on. So you guys can feel free to throw me a grade in here. I normally speak by saying and a good bit. So that is what got me some stuff taken off. But otherwise, I think the content was very good. And I'm just being an asshole and delaying. So let's just dive right into it. The first slide here, for those who are not viewing, is a slide that says, like the classic game we used to all play while watching Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. Now, there are 4 pictures, ignoring the GIF of Big Bird on the screen. One of them was supposed to be a business person. That is in the top left. Hello, CB in chat. The bottom left is, of course, Jeffrey Bezos from Amazon, representing, of course, Amazon in this scenario. In the top right, you have the Bucks County government, the local government for me, but that could be replaced with any government, local, that is. And then in the bottom right, you have the symbol for the Federal Reserve, aka the federal government that has control over the currency. So, largely what this book is about, and for those who, haven't been with me long enough to have seen me do a previous book review, I've previously reviewed books such as The Radical Hamilton, which is a great book. I'm gonna do it differently today just because I have this presentation, but I'm also gonna, give you the recommendations, the shortfalls, the good and the bad of this book. But modern monetary theory is something that we have kind of hinted on and touched on in this show in the past, but it is a macroeconomic theory that states that countries that control their own currencies, or as I would put it and how I talk about it, colloquially, whatever, however you say that. I mess that word up every single time. Shouldn't even say it. But they have sovereignty over their currency. So examples of this would be the United States, Japan. There's some European countries. I believe Great Britain would be considered that because they have the pound rather than utilizing the euro. Any country that controls the printing and the which thus, through transitive property here, controls the supply, controls the printing. So one way or the other, governments choose to prioritize their spending. And you'll see in the bottom, there is a weird looking bullet that just says stab, not tabs. Now, what this is, and I can get a little more political in this presentation than I did in school, but tabs, which is that second one, is something that Margaret Thatcher kind of coined. It says taxing and borrowing before spending. That is the economic theory loosely acquainted with neoliberalism. That is necessary to say that in order to spend government dollars, you need to first tax and borrow money for, if you're going into a deficit, you need to borrow. However, modern monetary theory turns that on its head and says, in order for a government to function, it needs to spend first and then tax and borrow to cover the costs. Now, how does this work? This works because it's a chicken and the egg, but you actually have an answer here. If you created a government, let's just say you and I and all the, dozens and dozens of fans of the show, we started our own country. And we needed to come up with a way to have economic exchanges. This would be through the form of a currency. Now, who creates the currency, who authorizes it, who prints more of it, that is up for us to decide as a democratic process, or maybe me, because I'm the host of the show, I am the authoritarian leader of this make-believe country. Either way, what is necessary for a transaction to occur in this type of currency-based economy, specifically a fiat currency, is there needs to be a supply of the currency to begin with. You need to have money in order to buy anything. And that's, of course, excluding, if you're bartering, whatever. But if you are coming to a conclusion that we have to have a currency, there has to be a supply of the initial dollars to get the spending and the economy kickstarted to begin with. Now, that is something that is a little bit like in the weeds, but it is necessary to understand that you need to spend and supply money, dollars in the United States case, into the economy for anybody like Jeff Bezos, like you, like me, to have dollars in our wallets, in our bank accounts, to spend on goods, services, etc. Then to have those people that get the goods and services sold to start businesses, to hire employees, and the cycle goes on. So there are 6 myths lined out in the book that are individual chapters of this book. So I will not do them all justice, I'm sure. The one in the top left, if you are watching the screen, is the key one that is necessary to debunk for any of us to even understand modern monetary theory, but the rest are necessary to be like a firm believer of that. So the top left it reads, the federal government should budget like a household. Now, this is something that it takes a second to kind of think about, but I would, and anybody in chat can feel free to throw answers in here, but I'll probably answer the question before anyone has the chance to respond. But anyone in chat want to talk about or bring up the last time the United States had a surplus or a balanced budget in the last 100 years? The only time it happened was during Bill Clinton's administration. And for the roughly 25 to 30 years since then, I think it's about 25 since yes, Bill Clinton, as we see in chat. But I'll talk about that in a second too. But that is the only surplus that has happened, I think, in even my parents' lifetime. So, and I might even go beyond that because of the World War II and spending. So, the reason why people always say that the federal government should budget like a household is because you and I have to ration what we buy because we only have certain amounts of money. We only make, a certain salary. We only make certain wage per hour. We only have so much savings. And we will get to, in the end, why this is BS, but the government does not have that same restriction. The government, specifically the Federal Reserve with the Treasury, can print more money. Now, that in and of itself is not explanatory of why the federal government should not budget like a household. That is not exactly explanatory of why modern monetary theory works. But it is a fact to say, and we're not talking about Weimar Germany here, because that's a straw man of what we're saying. You can print more money to meet the needs of the people, not just print more money to make the dollar useless, but to print to meet demand for services and goods. The federal government does not have to budget like a household, and I would argue, whether you believe in modern monetary theory or not, the government should not have a balanced budget. The federal government, that is. State and local governments absolutely necessarily need to, but the federal government does not need to have a balanced budget or a surplus. In fact, it is economically stimulative to have a deficit. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But we also have to remember that Bill Clinton, and I'm just going to bring this up in tandem here, that Bill Clinton's surplus in the 90s was due to, 1, massive austerity cuts, 2, massive, maybe not massive, but austerity tax increases. So austerity is the combination of raising taxes while cutting spending. That is the term that may get thrown around a little bit too loosely by people, the same way as neoliberal. But neoliberals usually support austerity to fund their priorities. They shift things around, right? We have a question in chat. Says, can you clarify the difference between deficit and debt? The deficit is the yearly budget, or I should say, the deficit is the amount that is expended over the yearly budget in revenues. So if you expect to have $1 trillion in tax revenue from a government and you spend $1.2 trillion, that 0.2 is the deficit. Year over year, that adds up. If you have a 0.2 deficit for 5 years, you will have a $1 trillion debt that has been added up. So the debt is the cumulative process of the deficit over years. And the deficit is, of course, just spending over revenues. So the top right, which is actually a good thing to kind of pivot into, is deficits are evidence of overspending. Remember, this is myth number 2. The deficit, as I smash my keyboard, is not evidence of overspending necessarily. It could be, but it's not necessarily. Overspending is typically represented by an increase in inflation, more driven by increase in demand than supply. So I'll talk about that again on the next slide with regards to COVID. Why the inflation that we're seeing right now is not evidence, in my opinion, of overspending. But we will get to that in a second too. The next one says, one way or the other, we're all on the hook. This is in regards to the national debt. I will remind you that the majority of the American debt is held by America. And just the same way that, and this is not to say that, oh, we could just, pull all these accounting tricks, but the same way that the student loan debt crisis is driven by debt held within our country that is forgivable by the federal government or payable by the federal government, because the debt could be paid, by the way. Those are choices. Those are things that the government could prioritize. And those are things that, if we needed to, we could do. I think that we should cancel all student loan debt. I don't think we have to pay off our entire national debt. We could start to pay off certain parts of it, sure. And remember that we don't have to have a revenue surplus to do that. But that might be a question that we bring up to Stephanie Kelton someday when we have her on the program. The next one says, government deficits crowd out private investment, making us poorer. This is provably false. You can just look to the New Deal era government deficits that actually increased private investments in infrastructure and in businesses throughout the country. The bottom left says, the trade deficit means America is losing. Trade deficits are not necessarily evidence of losing per se, although I would also argue that this is something that I don't necessarily agree with. This is one of the myths that I agree with the least, or I agree with the rebuttal the least, because if we look at COVID again, as we will on the next slide with regards to inflation, the supply chain being broken is an example of where America's imports, aka our deficit, we are importing more than we are exporting. We rely on more countries than rely on our goods and services sometimes. That is detrimental to our supply chain, which then creates arbitrary spikes in costs, which causes inflation, as we will talk about on the next slide. But a trade deficit could be beneficial if we wanted to argue that there is some level of efficiency in countries, or if you even wanted to take it down to the state level, in certain states having goods that they prioritize and specialize in. You don't want every state to have a steel production industry in it necessarily. It's good to have competition, but you don't need to have 50 states with a steel industry in it. You could have 5 or 6, and they can compete. And that's the way that capitalism would work in this system, which is how ideally capitalism would work. But we're not going to, we'll get into more of the critiques of capitalism, I suppose, in our talks about the train derailment. And then in the bottom right, we have, quote, entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare are financially unsustainable. We can't afford them anymore. Now, I'll just go to the next slide because I think I talk about this. But I'll just take the bottom part of this rebuttal first. So this next slide, just for everybody that is just listening, it says the people's economy, every issue on the federal level is a political choice. And I would say that that's my ideology summed up pretty well. Every issue is a choice of prioritization. So you can go to this bottom bullet point here. It says programs like, and now these are my opinions here. So these are my counter proposals to these myths. But programs like SNAP, which is food stamps, and Social Security are economically stimulative, which makes them, as in contrary to what it says, unsustainable. They're, in fact, sustainable beyond belief. They have economic multipliers. Specifically, SNAP is a great example of if you give somebody $1, they go and spend that $1 on food, and then that food is thus employing someone at the grocery store, and the grocery store supplies people in the area for restaurants, and they give jobs to different cashiers and to the people stocking the trucks, and the people that are stocking the trucks are transporting the goods from the farms, which are getting paid by the grocery stores. So you can see how this supply chain works and how $1 can ripple through and say, okay, if this SNAP dollar is invested, yeah, we're giving this person a hand up. But just because we're giving them this money, they can only use it on food. They're going to go spend that because everybody needs to eat. They're going to spend it. It employs people. The grocery stores make profits, etc. And it goes all the way down the line. Social Security, just to piggyback on the last slide, talking about how it's unsustainably funded, I would argue that regardless of its sustainability, Social Security and Medicare are the two most progressive programs to ever exist in this country, I'll include Medicaid with Medicare. But those are the two most vital programs to ever exist in American society that I could argue, and I would argue, but I have a funding mechanism to it, but I would argue that these are programs that are worth being lost leaders if we had to. We should spend more money than we have on these programs if we had to, because of their value to the nation. Social Security keeps about 30% of all senior citizens out of poverty. Medicare provides seniors with health care coverage. Medicaid provides people in poverty with health care coverage. Now, I think everybody should have health care coverage, universal, but it's not necessarily the case right now. So these are programs that we should prioritize regardless. Now, we've talked about this before, but Medicare and Social Security could easily be funded for infinity. Because Social Security has a cap on how much somebody pays. It's about $160,000, which you pay the tax on it. If you lifted the cap altogether, you would be smooth sailing for a very long time. Now, if you even created a donut hole from $250,000 to $400,000, there's no increase, but over $400,000, which is a top bracket of people, you're talking about the top 1% up here, they would pay more into the system and we would still be solvent for an extremely long time, way into our retirement if we ever get to retire as millennials. Now, the top bullet here is one of the most important points that I could make as an accountant, I think. The deficit in spending from a budget side should not be looked at as an income statement or a profit and loss, as I have written up here, but rather it should be looked at as a balance sheet. Government spending, because there is no incentive or no necessary incentive for the government to profit, governments can invest and spend money in places where it's going to create a deficit on the budget side, but it will create a surplus on the other side. Thus, if you are spending let's just take Social Security. Even if you had to, you don't have to, by the way, but even if you had to go into a deficit spending, you actually legally cannot do this in America. They cannot do this, Social Security, but I'm just using it for an example. There's a law, they cannot do this, but if they were to increase the budget, increase the deficit for Social Security, that means that although the government is seeing a deficit, that senior citizen, the group of senior citizens that are getting the money, are creating a surplus. And with that surplus, again, there is a high economic multiplier that ripples through the economy, stimulating growth, which the growth that the Reaganites and the supply siders always want to talk about growth. They never exemplify it. They never actually bring tax cuts, never bring the growth that they talk about. But economic deficits, budgetary deficits, Keynesian economics, you can argue monetary theory, however you want to look at it, demand side focused supply of money is where you get this surplus on the consumer side of the economy, even though there's a deficit on the government side. Now, this middle part is that it says some level of unemployment is a political choice, not an economic one. So for those who listened to the program, I believe 2 weeks ago, I had talked about, or maybe it was last week, talked about the state of the economy and how there is an extremely low unemployment rate. Now, the unemployment rate, and I said this in class, and I kind of got a little side eye, was the unemployment rate as it is right now is lower than economists expected full employment to be considered at, which was about 3 to 5%. We're at about 3%. So full employment was about 5%. And even if they were being generous, like when I was in high school, we were learning about it, it was about 4 to 6%. Granted, that was coming out of the Great Recession, but we are at 3%. And this is something that if we really wanted to, and this is something that Bernie Sanders ran on in 2020, we could have a government that provides jobs to all who want it. If we chose to give people jobs, pay them a decent wage, let them retire with dignity, we could really create an economy that focused on the people first and not necessarily just profits. We would be able to invest in our infrastructure, and it wouldn't necessarily have to be profit driven. We could invest in programs like for childcare, and it doesn't have to be profit driven, or education, and it doesn't have to be profit driven. And you see that middle bullet, inflation is the key indicator of overspending from a demand side. I'll talk about COVID really quickly. Remember, when there was those freight, not trains, I want to say freight train, but those freight boats off the coast of California, and there was all these ports locked down, and there was the supply chain was being disrupted because China wasn't exporting their microchips for computers and for cars and all this stuff. This was a supply side disruption. A supply chain disruption led to increase, and the same thing with oil and gas, because you saw that people act like this perplexes me. People act like gas and oil is not traded on a global scale, despite the United States having largely its own supply. The United States exports gas and oil. The companies are not nationalized, so they make decisions by themselves. So when we saw the increase in gas prices, it's because there was an increase in international gas prices and oil prices due to the war in Ukraine. Because of this decrease in supply overall, we see a price increase for consumers because, of course, the corporations, they have the duty, and again, we will talk about this with the trains, they have the duty to prioritize profit over country, profit over patriotism, profit over stakeholders. It is all for the shareholders, not for the stakeholders. So inflation driven by demand would be an indication of overspending, where people just have too much money and they're willing to spend unlimited amounts of money on a Snickers bar. But if you are in a supply side situation where there's just not enough of a good, that is not evidence of overspending. All right, and here's the final slide here to discuss. This goes back to that first slide. It says one of these things is not like the other. Well, the crux, the argument of this book right here, if I can get it in front of my face, my big stupid face, is that your government, your local government, Amazon, or even Jeff Bezos, maybe even Elon Musk, could theoretically run out of money. But as long as the priorities were right, investments were economically stimulative and made correctly, a people's economy could be achieved through the usage of modern monetary theory, because Uncle Sam can never run out of money. So, what does that mean? What do I believe? I believe loosely in the concept that modern monetary theory could be used, and it is used, but the rhetoric of it is tough to sell to the American people, especially after the last 50 years of neoliberalism taking over. The Great Depression represents a time where we saw deficit spending coming out of it, because remember that in economic downturns, in recessions and depressions, it is not only a priority to do so, it is necessary to deficit spend to get people out of a recession or depression. The New Deal represents big deficits, but it also provided people with jobs, provided people with retirements, it allowed people to live with dignity, etc. So this is where there's a give and a take. I don't believe every single word of what this book says. I don't believe every single word of the theory. But I think this book is worth a read. And if you're interested in learning about economics in a non-traditional way, this is a pretty simple read, but it's also complex and thorough, and it gets to the point, and it gives you a lot of examples to, kind of get your mitts into. So I think it's worth the read, and I think you guys should pick a copy up if you have the opportunity to.